to Books at Berkeley. I'm Judy Pinnolis, your host for this version, where we have today Dr. Teodros Kiros with us. Dr. Kiros is professor of philosophy at the Berklee College of Music and is the non-resident Du Bois Fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies at Harvard University, where he's been doing this for over 20 years. Dr. Kiros is also the host of The African Ascent, which is produced on community TV in Melrose, which he's been doing for over 15 years. Both of these programs are supported by Berklee College of Music and Harvard University. Dr. Kiros, we're going to be talking today about self-construction, one of your many of 25 books that you've published. And I'd like to start a little bit with having you tell us how this book came about and how it belongs in this vast array of your writings and intellectual scholarship.
First of all, I would like to take my time and express a heartfelt gratitude to you, Judy, who has given me for the second time an opportunity to reflect on my work as a teacher, as a writer, as a television producer. It was less than a year ago. You gave me a golden opportunity to reflect on one of my latest books, which preceded the book that I published with Cornel West, called Self-Definition, a philosophical inquiry from the global south to the global north. And if you recall, we had an incredible time because I had invited my good friend and my mentor, Professor Victor Wallace, from the same department in which I teach philosophy, to join us, which he did. And we combated one another on certain foundational ideas about the origin of humankind and the biological and anatomical structure of what it means to be a man and a woman. I fondly remember that particular interview. And now, as if that kindness is not enough, you have expressed a second degree of kindness to me. You have invited me now to reflect on one of my foundational books, I think. I wasn't exactly a spring chicken when I wrote that book. It was my third book. But if memory serves, I think I wrote this book in my early 40s, and it's one of the books that I've written which won a prestigious Michael Harrington Award in 1999 for being an outstanding book. And not that I deserved it, but what the judges who liked the book decided to confer on me. So let me begin then, now that you've given me this opportunity to document really my intellectual history. 10 days ago, I received out of nowhere a note from a high school mate whom I don't remember really, but I pretended that I did. And he sent me a note with a picture of mine at the age of 14, I think. He himself is now a very well-established writer from Eritrea, playwright. He told me that I had apparently written a play called There Can't Be Friends, which he said he resurrected after the high school decided to ban it. I don't know why it would be banned. I don't remember the play. Apparently, I did write such a play. And so, although I don't remember writing it, what this told me was that I've been looking for what I called recently, in one of the interviews that I gave, for a human being for a long time. Like Diogenes before me in ancient Athens, who on a broad daylight one day, he was discovered walking with a flashlight. It was in the middle of the day. It was a sunny day. And people who saw him asked him, Diogenes, why do you have a flashlight on a sunny day? Diogenes purportedly answered, I'm looking for a good human being. I guess that's what I've been doing since the age of 14. And so when I came to the States at the tender age of 19, and then enrolled at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, in which I think I was a philosophy minor, which led me to Kent State University to pursue two majors, a major in political science and a minor in philosophy. It's during that time that I met the great Herbert Marcuse, one of the icons of the West. And I was so honored to meet him. I told him that I'll be writing a master's thesis on him. He was charmed, and I did, out of which emerged my first publication. I think I was about 26 years old, on the Establishment, I think it was called. Which then, again, in that work, I'm also still looking for the human, because like Diogenes for me, I've been looking for the human for very, very, very a long time. The human in me and the human out there in the world as such, which then later led me to fall in love with Marxism. And so my dissertation, my PhD dissertation in political theory, in political philosophy at Kent State University was on Antonio Gramsci, the founder of the Italian Communist Party. There too, I'm still looking for the human, for the good human being that I want to see this world inhabited by. To make a long story short, that led me to write my first book under the guidance and the support of the great American philosopher, John Rawls, at Harvard University, whom I met through a good friend of mine who introduced me to him, and then he was kind enough to allow me to sit in his courses. At the time, he was lecturing on the theory of justice, the foundational liberal philosophic work on the idea of the good society. And I shared with him my draft of a book that I was developing based on his two principles of justice, which I liked considerably. And then I tried to apply these two principles of justice to what I call the African condition at the time, because there was a food crisis in Africa. And these two the principles of justice, I thought could empower human beings to overcome the pangs of hunger and poverty, provided that the policymakers and leaders are guided by principles of justice, the first one of which simply asks that all human beings, as I reconfigured it beyond Rawls, that all human beings should have a right, a human right to food, to shelter, to clothing, to health without any questions asked. And the second principle of justice then, contra to Rawls, because Rawls thought the second principle of justice should be the first, and the first should be the second. I was so pretentious, although I did not really fit his shoes at the time, but I was a very ambitious and confident young man, I think. I reconfigured the two principles of justice and made what he thought was second, namely the principle of liberty, the principle of freedom, as second in my mind. And I elevated what he thought was the second to the first condition, namely that before we satisfy the needs and rights of human beings to have food, shelter, clothing, and health services as deemed necessary, it makes no sense to speak about liberties and freedoms when human beings are suffering. That then brought me eventually to the book that we're going to examine today, namely Self-Construction.
Well, I found it just an incredibly, thank you for sharing that whole background, because it helps me understand a little bit more about the book. It's an incredibly powerful and, I mean, deeply thoughtful exploration on this philosophical topic of self-construction of the self and and power that people have, and how is that done? And honestly, almost every paragraph, there's a pithy statement worth quoting. I think that students would be able to go through this book very thoroughly and slowly. They will get a lot out of it. But I'd like to start really with the introduction and your first chapter, where you lay out the backgrounds, the philosophical backgrounds and arguments that happened over centuries, and bringing the reader into, where you're going. So I wanted to investigate the statement that the goal of the book was to allow people to see that a goal of self-construction is a person, a self filled with a compassion that is a composite of reason and feeling. And further, or later in the book, you stated language, truth, and desire are used by the compassionate self to construct values and norms. So I thought we'd start with that and explain to our listeners how you lay out those definitions of these really powerful terms. For example, what do you mean by values and norms? And start there and then build the case as you did in the book.
I appreciate the question, and a very well thought out question. What I try to realize in that chapter is the following. There was this long debate that I was intrigued by at the time that I was writing the book, with two philosophical icons among European/American philosophers, namely, in fact, European American is correct, because one of them is a European and American, and the other one is an American. And no, both of them, in fact, are not American, so both of them are Europeans, namely Jürgen Habermas, the German thinker, sociologist/philosopher, and Michel Foucault, the French archaeologist, genealogist, philosopher, historian. He embodies all with remarkable mind. So these two major figures are debating about the nature of the human, more specifically, the capacities of the human being, or the capacities of the self, with Habermas contending that under ideal conditions, and of course the ideal conditions remain to be ideal, they yet have to be realized even in 2022, and I even wonder if they ever be realized, if the climatic catastrophe in the horizon finishes the human species. As Chomsky contends sometimes, unless we regulate and change our fundamental behavior. But be that as it may, Habermas thinks that under ideal conditions, human beings are capable of arriving at truth, with capital T, by freely and responsibly participating in argumentation, free of domination, says Habermas. This insight struck positive chords with me as I'm looking for the human. So I said, there is something here that I could work with as a human being. I bracketed it for the time being. Then at the same time, Michel Foucault was challenging Habermas. What are the premises of Habermas's conception of the human being, in that under ideal conditions, the human being is capable of constructing normative foundations. That is, foundations that are essentially guided by norms. And by norms, of course, at the time I understood patterns of some kind. if you prefer models that human beings are capable of establishing and then solidifying and entrenching in the forms of customs and traditions from which human beings could draw. So in spite of all that has happened in human history, and as a German, Habermas is quite aware of what was done to our brothers and sisters in Germany, namely my Jewish brothers and sisters, who unnecessarily and cruelly were subjected to gas chambers, so forth and so on. He's aware of this. And yet this did not deter him as a good, thoughtful German to still think that human beings are capable of founding and participating in a society unlike the society that gave us the Holocaust. There is a faith here in what Habermas calls humans' communicative abilities, which is really a variant of what Chomsky, whom I have interviewed in African Center International, and I'll be interviewing him again at the end of February, also thought human beings are capable of doing. But unlike Habermas, Chomsky grounds communicative capacity that human beings have in language itself. He undertook a Copernican revolution in a similar fashion as Kant did, when Kant also gave three faculties, the faculty of the understanding, and the faculty of judgment, which gives us the imagination, and the faculty of practical morality, practical understanding. Theoretical understanding, practical understanding, the imagination. And Chomsky, on the other hand, draws something else out of this, what Habermas called this communicative ability that human beings have to legislate for themselves and legislate for others under ideal conditions that they are capable of constructing by participating in argumentations that are going to be guided less by strategic interests, material interests, but more by a commitment to the search for truth. Foucault challenged this because his premises, unlike that of Habermas, and this is very debatable, that he thinks that human beings might be capable of these communicative capacities that Habermas is attributing to them, but that there are what he calls these disciplinary regimes, that is the professions themselves, the medical professions, the academic professions at the university, the church itself, religious practices, make it nearly impossible for human beings to think under what he calls ontological freedom, the ability to draw from their capacity to generate values, generate them, and then live by using the values that they have founded at their very own. But that communicative capacities of human beings, Foucault says, are contaminated by these disciplinary regimes. I'm listening again. I said, now, these are two not necessarily antithetical and irreconcilable conceptions of human possibilities and human powers, but that these two icons thought that these two positions are irreconcilable. That is not what I thought. I said, in fact, we can develop a middle ground out of these two premises, out of these two conceptions of human possibilities, with one articulating the capacity of human beings as communicative subjects to be able to found values, norms, and interests that are not guided by, that are guided by an argumentation that is free of domination, and the Foucauldian response, namely that this ideal that Habermas is attributing to human beings is always obstructed and contaminated by these disciplinary practices. And in that, unless we change the disciplinary practices, it is going to be extremely difficult for human beings to construct values, norms, and interests in their own terms, under their own capacities to do so.
Yeah.
Then I said to myself, this gives me an opportunity to develop something different. I call this self-construction, which I carefully distinguish from what I called imitation and modeling. By imitation at the time I meant, and I continue to mean it that way, I haven't changed my mind. I was stimulated by Plato in the several books of the Republic, but most particularly in book 10, excuse me, in book 3, book 4, and book 5, to take on the poets very critically, in which it says poets and others have a tendency to produce crafts by imitating what is available in traditions and customs. He gives the famous example of the abstract idea of the bed, for example, which gives the conception of bedness. Now, a painter paints that bed. First, a carpenter crafts it, and then the painter comes and paints what the carpenter has crafted. So we began with the abstract idea of bedness, and then a second order imitation of it as it is designed by the carpenter, and then a third version of an imitation, namely the painter painting the bed crafted by the carpenter, and the carpenter himself abstracting from some idea of bedness. Here Plato says there is a problem. We are progressively losing our ability to formulate our own abstract ideas, such as the idea of bedness. Instead, we tend to think of what a bed is as we see it in a painting, as we further see it as produced by the carpenter, but we have now completely lost touch with the original idea of bedness. Plato uses the famous idea of forms, the form of the bed, which I have recently argued is an idea that the opulent Egyptian priests about 2,300 years ago developed in ancient Kemet. They were developing what we call this activity of philosophy, and Plato credits them because he has visited Kemet. He has been trained by an Egyptian philosopher who introduced him to these forms, these patterns that are stable, unchanging, such as the idea of bedness, for example. It's a stable, it's a permanent idea in our mind, and all human beings under ideal conditions are capable of abstracting from it. So I follow Plato's critique of imitation, and then I say this might create a problem for human beings because they might confuse what they are finding in traditions and customs, and may not strive and struggle to penetrate the original forms. Although they could, traditions and customs have this remarkable capacity to contaminate and reduce human beings to have a personal, private relationship with this form. So I debunk that. I see its inadequacy. Then I move to what I call modeling. Here, I see the same problem as I saw in the idea of imitation. Namely, let's think in terms of these famous human beings, whom in our own times we call celebrities, that we see on TV, how they live, where they go, where they eat, where they hang out, what they buy, what musics they produce, what kinds of cars that they drive, where they sleep, how they sleep. All this bombards us every single day. And then we are stylizing our lives in reference to these celebrities whom we think could function as models for us. I say, but there is a difference between praising a model, a celebrity that you see on TV, about whom you know nothing other than the convoluted, feigned, artificial form of glamour and greatness that is being given to you. And exactly as in imitation, up to a degree, and also in modeling, I sense what I call the absence of thinking. That the person is not thinking for themselves, that they are being bewitched by these ideas and practices and actions that they are imitating, third order imitations, and much more destructively, the models up to whom they are styling their lives. In the second model, also, there is an absence of thinking. Then I introduce what I call self-construction. Note now, the capacity that that is going to empower individuals to be able to construct what I call values and norms by assembling, by putting them together for the first time, is exactly what Habermas was defending, namely the communicative abilities of human beings to draw from their capacities, inherent, inalienable capacities that they have, and found values. That is the key argument. They don't find these values in customs and tradition, Judy. They create them. They construct them, guided by thinking. I call this capacity to translate or to apply this inalienable, inherent right that we have to construct values as something that is in us.
Yeah,
it doesn't have to come from outside. It is inside each and every one of our Judy.
I think that was very powerful. Excuse me I didn't mean to interrupt, but it was a very powerful point where this ability to self-construct is the grounding for self-empowerment. You wrestled with these countering arguments that happened between Foucault and Habermas, and you quote Foucault, who sees language itself as an expression of power. Power is embedded within this language. And one of the things that really was quite a powerful statement is that power produces reality. That power, from these words, they're producing the reality for other people. And I was wondering, how can one's own self-construction, the empowerment that you get from self-construction and your values that are created there, fight against these other powerful forces of a being who is producing reality for others, such as a powerful politician?
Yes.
Whereas you point out that Foucault said they don't see power as evil, but as a strategic game.
Exactly.
I mean, that was, they don't even really care. They're using this power, but they were producing reality for other people. And so if we're using self construction to create our power through our own self construction. How does that fight against this powerful being who's producing reality for others?
That is a remarkable question. I'm still struggling with it, Judy. Since I wrote Self-Construction and the Formation of Human Values in 1999, I have grown considerably, intellectually, that is. I discovered the literature of ancient Egypt, for example, when I began teaching a course called Africana Philosophy, because up until then, my training was strictly in linguistic analytic philosophy, and my references rather were Western philosophers. Mm-hmm. It was only after I wrote what some people think, I don't know whether they are right or not. And there is a book that is highly celebrated in Amazon.com on a 17th century Ethiopian philosopher by the name of Zara Yacob, on whom I wrote in 1985. It's a highly celebrated work in which I introduce the reader to one of the founders of what we call modern philosophy, namely Zara Yacob, the Ethiopian in the 17th century, who was a contemporary of Descartes, but he had already made a case for the Enlightenment, if you like, for the capacity of human beings to construct values and norms for themselves. And then a year later, Descartes joins them, and both of them become the founders of what we call modern philosophy. And what makes modern philosophy? Modern philosophy is this inherent ability of human beings who have been endowed with reason to be able, as Habermas says, be communicative the speakers of a language, because they have this inherent reason inside them that could interrogate, retrograde, provincial, unnecessary, oppressive cultures, traditions, and customs by the yardstick of reason. And so I unraveled this at that particular time. Okay. And then I became introduced to an alternative formulation of the founding of modernity, which we're accustomed to think was once again, as most things, founded by Caucasians. But then I uncovered the fact that he was an Ethiopian, an African, in fact, who made a case for the place of reason, hence for the possibility of creating, modernizing institutions as critiques to traditions and customs. I also discovered the Upanishads, these masterworks from Eastern philosophy. One of my celebrated courses at Berklee College of Music, and I love this course, is Eastern philosophy. What I learned from Eastern philosophy, which I was not privy to when I wrote Self-Construction and the Formation of Human Values, are these techniques of the self. Foucault was struggling with this, but there is no reference to the Upanishads, no reference to the literature of the global South. Even Judy Butler, whom I adore, does not refer to Kemet, does not refer to the productions of the global South. It's all centered on the North. I was also a participant in celebrating the literature of the global North, Judy. But then I discovered the Upanishads. What did I discover in particular? Detachment, the necessity of the self to detach itself from external objects. This is an activity, crucial activity for the construction of values that I did not know anything about, Judy. I said, my God, I wasn't really as stupid as I thought I am. That I was struggling with how we can convert this capacity that human beings have to construct values for themselves as something that could be done only and only by the individual in solitude. You cannot learn this absolutely necessary technique of detaching yourself from what you don't need when you're being bombarded by the media, by advertisements, by models, if you like, by the practices that you're imitating, which self-construction is attempting to put an end to without doing the internal work of self-cleansing. If I were to write self-construction and the formation of human values, again, I would begin with the chapter on attachment and detachment. Ideas that did not even occur to Habermas and Foucault. They thought that this cleansing could be done by reason and reason only. But reason is embodied in the human brain. And the brain is a limited physical organ.
You know, I mean, to some extent, reason cannot compete in a world where people are creating truths that are not empirical.
Yes.
You know, so when you have a society where, you know, people are looking for reason and truth through reason, they're looking at things in a kind of an empirical way, what's going on. And here we see that a society today, and this was expressed in one of the most striking, short but pithy statements that you comment in your book, that power does not repress truth, it produces them. And so if you're trying to reason with other people and show empirical evidence and things like that, they're being subjected to the production of truth from this power. You cannot reason your way out of that. You have to approach it from another way. And I thought that that was one of the most insightful comments of your book, because it provides a way to view what's going on and have an understanding of what's going on that will give people a methodology of dealing with what's going, with the current moment. And it was a very striking comment. And I also think this is interesting that you would then also include and layer on this additional idea of detachment, because you know, this idea that Foucault saw power as as domination, and others such as yourself do not think it's the same thing. Power and domination are not the same thing. It's a distortion. And I was wondering if you could, you know, talk a little bit about that, because it seemed to be a blind spot in the European Enlightenment.
Absolutely.
A blind spot in its inability, because it's not recognizing kind of all these other ways of being and these ways of creating truth. And there's no consensus on this right now. And by the way, I was going to ask you if consensus is a desirable goal. I mean, you kind of put that out there, and I was like, okay, well, do we need consensus? Is that something that we should be striving for? And if not, you know, what are the ways that we are going to construct, you know, a societal norm, or create those values and norms within a group if consensus has become so outmoded and suspect?
Both questions are really potent, and you're giving
on and on and on.
No, you've read the book so carefully. One of the contributions that I think I have made, in addition to the analytic distinctions that are established between imitation, given its inherent limitations that I addressed myself to, modeling, similarly, inherent limitations, which I think I attended myself to. In both instances, I uncovered what I call the absence of active thinking. In imitation, we're merely responding to what is being thrown at us. In modeling, we're really being encouraged to simply exemplify what I think is the best, only because we have been given the visions and descriptions of the glamorous, the beautiful that we should go after. And then in self-construction, there is an attempt, however flawed, however incomplete it might be, the individual, as an individual, is attempting to use reason and find values and norms that fulfill them. In addition to that, I hope I'm not giving myself too much credit. And I am also, I think, one of the first to have distinguished what you pointed at. We're accustomed to think that power is domination. We've been told this for years. It was first articulated by Thomas Hobbes, the European hero in the 17th century, who argued that the human is nothing more than a bundle of desires, desire after desire, something that does not end until we enter the casket, from which then he drew a justification of the sense in which human beings are selfish, brutish, and life itself is nasty and short. The nastiness, the shortness is encouraged further by these humans who are attracted to desires for which they think there shouldn't be any limit, so that they can accumulate as much as they can, so that they can exploit others in any way they want. And all this is justified by the premise that human beings are desiring beings, and in that they stop desiring only and only when they die. Secondly, the same justifications of the desires is also sadly present in Weber, although Weber does it in a slightly different way than Hobbes does, because he at least had the audacity to distinguish what he calls force from power, in which force is realized, is exacted, because there is someone out there who thinks he or she is powerful, who is going to exert force to make others follow him. I argue that is not necessarily the case, that power is not always domination. There is also a kind of power that nobody has talked about, I argued in that book, which I call self-empowerment. These are the distinctions that I have established. Power as domination looks at the human other, following Weber, as something that we can exercise power on in the form of force. Power as self-empowerment, on the other hand, gives human beings to be aware that unless they are mindful and vigilant, that they might occasionally, if not most of the time, be inclined to exercise power as domination. They can control this inclination to exercise power as domination by generating certain internal standards of reasonable, but much more deeply, spiritual excellences that are going to mitigate against this force that is coming at them in the form of power as domination and say no to it. No, I am not going to abuse my neighbor. No, I am not going to accuse undocumented immigrants, for example, as sources and justifications of my misery and suffering, because they are taking jobs and positions that should be given to me. Instead, when you begin to experience power as self-empowerment, what this leads you to is to look at those whom you think are the sources of your suffering to be human beings who are also suffering like you, because they are coming from places in which they are miserable, in search of a life where they think their life could be different. To make these kinds of connections requires of us to control desire. The desire to hate, the desire to discriminate, the desire to exploit, the desire to insult, the desire to be indifferent, the desire to be complacent, the desire to be content. When human beings like you are suffering, neither Habermas nor Foucault, to the extent that I know their literature very deeply, have gone this far. That which empowered me to think this way, now that I have grown, is my discovery of detachment. When you feel this inclination to harass others, to exploit them, to discriminate them, not to care for them, it is precisely because you have accumulated this bundle of desires that philosophers have told you are natural. Detachment makes it possible for them to do two things. One, to be mindful that demons of desire are entering and corrupting your soul. And B, and much more importantly, I developed this in the pragmatic section of the book. You take it upon yourself as a mission, as a vocation to say, no, I am not going to do this. Here, prayerfulness helps. If you're religiously inclined, meditation even helps more to quiet down the demons inside you. This cannot be done by reason alone. This cannot be done by the brain alone. It requires on your part to create what I call moments of solitude, in which you're going to be visited upon by supra-intelligence. Supra-mind is what Sri Aurobindo, the master Indian thinker, called it. Beyond reason, beyond rationality. One doesn't have to be a dogmatic anything, a dogmatic Christian, none of this is necessary. All that you have to be aware is that there is an intelligence beyond the brain-generated intelligence that you have, through which you can think, you can cleanse yourself and be the kind of human being that you want. No, you have to create moments of solitude for you to be visited upon by this intelligence of intelligences. Once again, that is inside you, but that you must first develop the habit of making time every single day to encounter this intelligence of intelligences. And in one of my books, I locate this intelligence of intelligences in the human heart, where, to return to the earlier paragraph that you liked, there is this composite of reason and feeling inside the human heart. That is probably where this intelligence of intelligences resides. But you must declutter yourself in order to be visited upon and in order to begin developing a relationship. I call this thinking in solitude, where you exercise what I call in the book existential seriousness. I did not know any of this, Judy, in 1999.
It seems to go together. I mean, your advocacy of self-construction, you talk about constructing something and actively assembling it, making it, originating it. And to have the time to do that self-work, and for the individual to have time to uh, think about the things that have shaped them, their parents, society, their education, is to embark on this project of self-construction, is to embark on a very enormous mental, emotional struggle for a lot of people. And some people will be able to undertake that, and some people will fall back on what they've been taught. And as you say, the societal norms that have been constructed for us. And that is something that people can wonder about. And you ponder in this book, you provide some methodologies, as it were, to go forward with that. And I guess a lot of us, certainly maybe in our early years, maybe often throughout life, I don't know, try to figure out this right path that can lead to the things we talked about: the truth, beauty, justice, happiness, all those good things in life, the good life, the ideal life, a life well lived. Um, and knowing that there's this internal struggle as part of it, what advice would you give a young person who might read this book and then undertake such a quest?
I appreciate that question. Remember, you were quite kind in the first interview on self-definition, and we did think a little bit about this issue. What I advise my students at Berkeley, at Harvard, wherever I'm honored to be an advanced student who's trying to teach students, both of us are students. I'm just more advanced than they, as I tell them, and I mean it, is that they have to make time every day for thinking. It's not enough, I tell them, particularly as musicians, to hide yourself in your room and rehearse endlessly without adequate sleep, without adequate self-examination. They look at me because I asked some of them, how many hours did you sleep last night? 2 hours.
Not enough.
No, you're
No.
tired.
Yeah.
You are just tired. So life is short. Why do you make it even shorter? By not allowing yourself at least an adequate number of hours to sleep. I recommend about 5. I sleep between 4 and 5 hours myself.
No. I
That
thought I was bad.
so that when I wake up in the
Not
morning,
enough sleep.
this is the truth. I sit in one of my favorite rooms at home alone. I sit for about 2 hours thinking. And that is when I feel as if I'm being visited upon by thoughts. But how could these thoughts come to me if I don't create an environment that could invite these thoughts to visit with me?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that the case? It's like inviting a guest at your home for which you have no time. The guest becomes a guest only and only if there is time which justifies him or her to be your guest. Similarly, the thoughts that may want to visit with you would have to feel that they are being invited. So this requires emptiness every day. I don't think we need to empty our minds from thoughts. On the contrary, I think we should think so that we can invite higher thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
This is perhaps a less than precise and convoluted way of making a case for the unnecessity of what I hear in certain Buddhist circles, namely the emptiness of the mind from thoughts. I disagree. We don't have to empty our minds from thoughts. No, we have to think so that we can invite thoughts superior to the thoughts that we had when we are thinking, because they're going to come from another quarter, another zone.
I think musicians understand this idea of daily practice. That you cannot achieve a certain level without going through and practicing something all the time. It can't be just once in a while, or you can't cram learning music, or something like that. You have to have a practice and a daily practice and make it part of you. And I think that's something musicians, a lot of students in the school would understand that idea of a daily practice.
Yeah. And additional to Judy, perhaps you do this also. I write 1 page a day. I have been doing this for 40 years. 1 page. Not that it's publishable, but at the end of the year, I have about 360 pages to look at. I conquer the fear of writing by writing.
That's very good practice for anybody.
I think so. Instead of wondering whether or not I'll have something to write about, I have this 360 pages of gibberish that is at least written, which I could look at the end of the year. And then I'm looking at a potential book, small book, but a potential book, out of which I may get 20 pages, if lucky. But the material is written already, you see, Judy. I also advise my students, those students who want to learn how to write. I share this technique with them. I have been quite lucky to have produced 25, perhaps, mediocre books, but they are my books. I will have justified my existence when I transition.
Don't sell it short. I thought it was a good book, and I think even just the first chapter, the way that you explain the philosophy and the philosophical arguments that went on about thinking in power, it's very worthwhile for students, because it's a good summary, and the other chapters devoted to the arguments that you give on self-construction are very interesting. And I think a lot of students would very much value something that approaches solutions to the societal issues and the changes in society that are going on today, and having some way of learning about how they can understand those kinds of issues, especially with the kinds of power issues that are going on so much in the world today. Well, I want to wrap this up just because we could talk for hours and hours. And this is a Books at Berklee. And I appreciate you talking to us about your book, Self-Construction. I'm sure there is a lot more that we could discuss about this book. It's pithy, but very interesting. And I'm very also interested to see if you'll rewrite some of it or add some of it with the Eastern thought in the future. That'll be something we'll look forward to.
Thank you.
Thank you again. And this is Judy Pinnolis at Books at Berklee.
Thank you very much, Judy. Thanks for the honor.